Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is still wrapped in a pandemic, 2 years in now. And this is the Sustain What webcast of the Columbia Climate School and Earth Institute. I'm Andy Revkin. Very pleased to sort of step back a little bit from the flow of frantic news, headlines about collapse, movies about denial, Don't Look Up, which I've been writing about on revkin.bulletin.com. But today, the next hour, we're going to reflect a little bit on language, both how it can intensify conflict and division and how it can, with some work, lead to more mellifluous exchanges and more productive outcomes for society. Incredibly pleased to have Pádraig Ó Tuama. How do you pronounce your last name?
Ó Tuama.
Ó Tuama. Pádraig Ó Tuama, Irish-born, in residence right now at Columbia University through Peter Coleman, and focusing on peace speech. And Peter Coleman here is a psychologist who has built he spent a lot of time studying conflict, and lately he's been trying to understand places in the world that are anomalously peaceful, which fascinates me. We think in journalism, we think of peace as just being the absence of war, but it's a state of being that can be very different and can be sustainable. Doesn't feel that way all the time these days, especially we're at war with ourselves in so many different ways. So Pádraig is here, and Irene O'Garden, my good friend, just a couple miles away here in the Hudson Valley in Lenape territory, which we both cherish the land around us. Irene is a poet, an essayist, and educator. And let's just get right into this. I do want to start, Pádraig and Irene, with a little music from a session, literally a music session that we did here that'll just set the tone to make sure we're understanding today's conversation is more about the soul than necessarily data, which is the kind of thing that I focus on here most of the time. So here's Tom Chapin. Let me make sure I get this right. It should work. And I'm just going to click play, unless I'm screwing up, which I probably did. You know what? I screwed up. There you go. Let's get back to the words. I'll get to the music in a minute. So Pádraig, tell us a little bit about yourself. You have a background in theology, poetry, and you're digging in a bit on climate and other things while you're here. What's been your journey? What's made you who you are so far?
Thanks very much for having me on, Andy, and I'm delighted to be with you and with Irene as well. I suppose poetry, language is really at the heart of so much of what interests me. I grew up speaking Irish and English. Some Americans often call Irish Gaelic, although that is an umbrella term. And so I suppose being aware from an early age that translation was a necessity, that there were different ways of saying different things, that some things don't translate from one to the other. Alongside that came the realization that in Ireland, we don't always speak Irish. We normally speak English. Absolute vast majority of people do. At the age of 5, it's said in my family, I asked my parents, I was fluent already in Irish and English. I asked my parents, why don't we speak Irish all the time? And that is the introduction to political reality, of course. I think my parents tell me that they told me, well, there's this place called England, and they like to go places. It's a very generous and innocent way to talk about an opening up to a political reality. And I thought, I like to go places. I like to be the seaside, my friend's house. But for me, therefore, the question about language and the question about politics and war have always been the same thing. It has always been impossible for me, really, to separate the question of language from the question of history. What language is spoken where and why, and who decided and how was it decided, and what's happening as a result of trying to respond to that. And then alongside that came an interest in religion. I'm from a family of deep devotion. And so I suppose for a long time I was very devout myself. I've done a few degrees in theology. I'm much more agnostic, really, but I suppose agnostic with deep respect for the language of religion and
Excuse me.
for the poetry of religion. And so language, conflict, and religion have been these three things that have interacted with each other my whole life. I did train in theology and have published in poetry, but neither of those bring in a career. They don't put bread on the table. So I trained in conflict mediation as well. And so for most of the last 20 years, I have worked as a conflict mediator in the north of Ireland, particularly looking at the long legacy of British-Irish conflict and the impact that leaves. And so I've always been curious about the language people use when they're speaking and the poetics of language when they're speaking and how potent that can be sometimes.
Yeah, in so many ways. And even there, the poetry or the allure of language can divide as much as congeal people. Great speeches of hate, Mussolini, and it's so there too. How even artful words are used can be an interesting part of the problem or solution.
Enormously. I mean, you can be carried into the emotion of a piece of oration in a way that uplifts you or in a way that decimates your imagination of the other. You can be, through a diabolical kind of poetry, you can be brought into the dehumanization of somebody who is the butt of what is being discussed. So language is far from being neutral. Language has an extraordinary sectarian power. And I suppose I'm curious, like lots of us are, about what are the dynamics of language that can cut through the possibility of language being used for sectarian purpose and really do something surprising.
Well, we'll get into that sort of the architecture of the exchange of language, which I think is a key to this, I assume, from your mediation work.
Yeah.
So much of that's about listening to language as well as producing it. Now, Irene, maybe you've been on this show several times, and it's great to have you back. Right in the early days of the pandemic, you were flipping around the way we were thinking and feeling about the confusion and stress by articulating how we were in a moment of potential metamorphosis as a species, even thinking about the virus and its impact on us physically, our social division. And how are you doing now? And could you explain a little bit how you became who you are so far and what you do? I haven't mentioned your books and your writing yet. So.
Well, for heaven's sakes, words have always compelled me, delighted me. I love to play with them. I love anything that amplifies the meaning of words. So I was an actress for a long time because that was amplifying the meaning of words. I do calligraphy, so that amplifies it in a different way. But I think they're so precious. And what I love about them is it's a birthright of all of us. We come in ready for language. We come in listening for language and speaking it and babbling it. And so it is an incredibly human thing. And the other thing that I love about language, and then I'll get on a little bit to what my journey has been. The other thing that I love about language is that when we start a sentence, we actually don't know how we're going to end it. And that to me is a very magical property because it lets us know that language is not so much the sequence of words in a sentence as it is the intent behind it or the meaning, which is this thing that I'm always trying to amplify and clarify. And it's what I delight in when I'm working with words is like, not what's a good word, but what is the word. And it's like a little treasure hunt for me. So as a means of communication that we are all gifted with, it's to me one of our most precious things. And that's why listening so carefully to how people are using language with one another, as you do, Pádraig, and trying to help people connect with one another in words that could be less damaging is such a powerful thing. So my words take many forms. I think I am essentially a poet. And as you are pointing out, the vast sums of money that poets make in our society. I laugh at that because actually what I love about poetry and writing poetry is that it is that clear artesian spring within us. There's no commercial use for it. So it's very pure. And so I really like doing that. I like working with young poets, which I'm doing now, and mentoring a young writer who is gifted in many ways. And so using our impulse for meaning and taking great care with how we interact with one another, very important to me. You were asking me about my flipping the idea of the early pandemic. I know in the early panic days, people are like, is it going to be a Great Depression? Is this going to be a recession? Is this going to be, and all those essions. And I woke up one morning thinking about, well, what is really abundant now? Not what are we missing, but what is abundant? And all I could see was the compassion that is so abundant and continues to be abundant, in spite of the fact that people are, that we're not over this yet. There are still people treating one another with incredible care. And most of the people in the world are doing that now. We still get these explosive images and these focuses, but on a daily basis, most people are trying to help their families. Most of the healthcare workers are trying to offer compassion to us. So, and I still feel very present with that idea. We don't know how long this metamorphosis will take, but I believe that it's in process.
That's so interesting to me. Before the pandemic, I don't think I had ever absorbed or thought about what's now a fairly well-established concept, the care economy, meaning the unreimbursed parts of our economy, people who are caring for people at home, unpaid, people who work maintaining the hospitals so that the nurses and doctors can function. And the care economy really only became evident when it was stressed and in our faces now.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping this got into the federal debate about funding for infrastructure. This is another word. What are the structures in a society or in a country? It's not just dams and power supplies. It's people. And so maybe there is some more richness that we've had as a result of this experience so far. And Pádraig, I don't know if that feels resonant or not.
A little bit, not really. I used to work as a cleaner in a hospital. And so, I used to clean up rooms after people died or had particular episodes. I used to clean up operating theaters after people had been operated on. And so I suppose, lots of my jobs when I was younger were either cleaning toilets, cleaning operating theaters, cleaning hospital rooms, cleaning kitchens. And so there is an entire unobservable and unobserved experience that you're often just seen as the cleaner, and there's a dehumanizing within that can come along. And so I suppose I would say that it's interesting to pay attention to what it took for those vital roles to be paid attention to.
Yeah, which it shouldn't, of course, require that.
Extreme. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit, Pádraig, about the goals you have these coming months, and we'll circle. I want to get back to that concept of the mediation part, which is really about the listening part of talking. But so, what is this project at Columbia with Peter? Here's a little visual. What is peace speech?
So, I suppose I'm really interested in how it is that we understand conflict, and Peter Coleman's extraordinary work through this enormous. Here it is. The Morton Deutsch Handbook on Conflict Resolution, this magnificent tome, obviously is everybody's nighttime reading and morning time reading. So I'm really interested in this as an analytics about how we understand conflict. But everybody understands conflict in their own way, from their family, from their friends, from their workplace, from the systemics that they're subjugated to. How is it that we negotiate those? What are the intuitions that we have about conflict? And I'm interested in how poetry explores those intuitions. I'm not really interested in finding poems that prove a conflict theory. That I think that's to demean art. What I'm really interested in is saying, let's bring a poem that knows something about conflict into conversation with a conflict theory. And so the project really is to put together a book of 30 or 35 poems, not mine, international poems, and then to write a little introduction to each one of those poems that just holds the tension of the poem's intuition and a conflict theory. It really is a conversation about humanities and social sciences. And within the context of that, conflict isn't only imagined as interpersonal, it's also imagined as existential when it comes to the question of conflict with climate and with the planet. So that's the project.
Yeah, conflict with the planet. Our relationship with the planet is super important to me, of course. And so much of it then devolves into our relationships with ourselves. My first book was on the murder of Chico Mendes, a Brazilian activist and labor activist who got kind of characterized by the outside world as an environmentalist, but he was really about the people who were being displaced as ranching was moving into the Amazon rainforest. And it was my early journalism before that was really looking at the environment in kind of a mechanistic way. And that's when I realized much of what we think of as environmental conflict is really related to human conflict. So we'll talk more about that as the months go ahead. I see.
Yeah, well, I mean,
sorry.
One person to highlight in this who's an extraordinary character really in terms of the analysis about conflict and environment is Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in the late, or it kind of, was it around 2006, 2005 she won it. So she was the first woman in Kenya to get a PhD in science. And she had noticed that the streams and the creeks that she used to play in as a child had begun drying up, partly, in fact, often because the arriving settlers, the Europeans, the colonists, had ripped up the fig trees. And it was often for religious reasons, because the fig tree was considered to be a local kind of religious plant. And so in the name of supplanting local religion and bringing in Christianity, the fig tree had been ripped up. However, the fig tree had adapted, particularly to the area where she was from, such that it had really deep roots and was holding an enormous amount of the earth together. And so with the killing of these trees, erosion began, and therefore lack of access to water. And with lack of access to water came increased conflict between people who needed the resource of water. And so there's a direct correlation to European missionary ideas of religion, to conflict, and to our relationship with the earth. And she decided to plant 7 trees, and I think she said 5 died of the 7. And then she planted 50 million trees and began what's called the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, for which she then won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And she's an extraordinary figure in terms of how she speaks wisely about that, you know, we are not in separate schools of religion, of post-colonialism, of conflict analysis, of environmental sustainability, etc., of politics. She sees them all as being held together in this particular experience where everything coalesced into the situation where people had to fight over water.
Amazing. Well, let me bring Reggie Harris in. He's in the green room, and now he's right here. Reggie, it's great to see you again.
Hi, Reggie.
Hey, how are you? Great to see you all.
Reggie's in upstate New York. I assume it looks like you're at home.
I am home. I'm here in the Helderbergs. And it's a nice, cold, cloudy day, but you know, this is part of the joy of living is to enjoy the seasons, and it's very seasonably chilly today.
It's wonderful to have you here again. And you know, when I was thinking about Pádraig's work, which is about words and artistry and belief and mediation and getting past conflict, I couldn't resist reaching out to you to be part of the conversation because of so many we've had so far that relate to these core issues.
Well, yeah.
Whether it's conflict over racism, your family history, of course, as we've talked about here before, is a stunning example of finding common ground amid divisions, really going back to the history of slavery and your music and the way you. I brought up in a conversation with Pádraig yesterday your little experience on that town green, and when a BLM rally and a MAGA rally coincided.
Oh.
So it's wonderful.
Quite the day. Yeah, no, I was thrilled when you wrote, and to be connected also to the idea of in the shelter of each other, which has been certainly part of my life since that conference back in the 1980s. Actually, early 90s. And just the whole idea, and looking where we are today, with, just so many factions zipping off and trying to create balance in their own silos, ignoring. I love that fig tree story. I hadn't remembered that about Wangari Maathai. But so.
Can you bring us, I asked Pádraig and Irene to sort of chart briefly their how they became who they are so far. And I don't think I've asked you that before on here. Like, how did you become the songwriter and solution seeker you are? What?
Well, I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I was born into a black community there. My family was the first. I didn't know this until I was about 26, but my family was the first African American family to move into an all-white area. And then within a year and a half, white flight. Changed the dynamics and the demographics of the area. So I grew up in a sort of protected African-American community, but that was at risk. And I didn't know in those days that we were at risk, as so many people were across the nation. I got an opportunity to go to a school out of my area, as they were integrating public schools in Philadelphia, and folks looked out for me. They saw opportunities. A white school that was 5 neighborhoods away, which opened me up to a whole new range of perspectives and put me in a situation where, and of course, music was at the center of that. I joined the choir. And as a choir, we toured around Philadelphia and sang in all these different places and different places of faith. But I met people who connected me to other people, so that years later, some of those connections led me to Clearwater in the Hudson Valley. Yeah. And suddenly I got a whole new appreciation of the environmental movement, which was at that time just starting. Met Pete Seeger, met you, and then met so many folks who then took me across the nation as a performer. I was introduced to the guitar by a girlfriend who challenged me. She said, if you don't want to learn 2 chords, I don't think I want to go out with you anymore.
Wow.
So that's how my career started. But through my travels, I've just had the benefit of meeting people from different areas, different places around the world, who introduced other things to me that I never would have come in contact with had I gone to the school 2 blocks up the street from me. And the the synergy that comes from that, how these little mistakes or these little moments that should not perhaps happen, when they happen, they create lines of communication around the world that we don't know are possible. So I'm a great appreciator of the fact that our connections make wide-ranging possibilities happen, because I'm an example of exactly that.
Yeah. So I'd love to maybe have you each cast back to some experience, some particular experience, an exchange with somebody that illuminates this potentiality for better or worse in how we speak and listen. I don't want to, if it takes a little time, don't worry. But was there some particular moment that illustrated the potential to flip things through language or listening? Maybe Pádraig first, and then Irene.
There's so many. One small one is one time I was working for a mediation organization, and me and my colleague were having real difficulty. It wasn't that there was one thing that happened. There was just a disconnect. I couldn't figure out what happened. And our boss, Mary Lynch, we both of them, me and the other mediator, said, we need help. And so he said to the boss, what's going on? She she brought us into a room for kind of an informal mediation, all of us mediators, and all finding it so difficult to figure out what is the thing that's causing the tension. I was a freelancer. I was the only freelancer in the room. And the tension began to erupt again between us, me and this other mediator. And I kind of countered back and said, I don't know what's going on. And Mary Lynch, who was in charge of it, said, okay, currently we're just having a he said, she said kind of thing going on. So she said, she turned to the colleague and she said to the colleague, what is the pain? And the pain was, my colleague said, I thought I'd see you more often, but you're only ever in the office when you're working. You're never here for lunch. You're never here for... And I was saying, that's so helpful to know. I'd love to see you more often. I am a freelancer, so when I'm not here, I'm working on another project. It's, you know, and to say, oh, well, we have lunch once a week, yeah. And it was such a simple thing, but Mary Lynch's intervention by giving us a critique to say, here's the direction your language is going. To think of it from the point of view of a piece of theatre, she was saying, here's the plot, and it's really boring, okay? And it's going nowhere. And she basically invited us to interrupt the plot by saying, what is the theme? What is really happening? What's the pain that's driving this energy? And then it was the bravery of my colleague to have enough self-reflection to say, actually, here's what the grief is. And then the conflict and the demand turned into an invitation. Will we see each other more often? Yeah. Lunch? Lovely. I'm buying. You know? And it's such a small example. But I think small examples can be really helpful sometimes, because often we think of huge, enormous things. But regularly, the way a conflict is showing up in a room is a conflict that's happening between two people that is linked to something much bigger. That conflict was linked to a bigger situation of me being a freelancer and basically thinking, look, I need to work all the hours God sends, because I'm never sure, I'm not given sick pay, I'm not given, you know, there were systemic issues going on, but actually the conflict as it was happening was just going to be, that particular element of the conflict was going to be helped just by us saying, well, let's have lunch together once a week. Lovely. And then I was able to talk about the systemic issues in terms of a conflict. Right. So it's not just that, you know, have lunch once a week and it's all lovely. There were other issues, but it was possible sometimes that when you can find the capacity to turn towards each other and not be distracted by the most personal, dramatic form of conflict that's escalating, I was able to then turn with allies to the conflict that was more systemic, which was that in that situation, that freelancers are regularly not in a situation where you can shoot the breeze with your friends, because you're thinking, I'm not being paid for this. I don't have a salary. Right. I've got to go and do some other piece of work.
And that requires a moment of reflection, you know, time. It requires breathing room. That's so interesting. By the way, I think it's refreshing in a way to know that even conflict mediators can't recognize their own conflicts.
especially there is, I will tell you this, you'll all know this, there is no industry so filled with conflict as the peace industry. And that is not an indication of hypocrisy. You cannot engage with conflict without engaging with it, and you don't engage in an abstract theoretical way with these things. You embody them, you take them in. The serious question is how, therefore, do I pay attention to how this is showing up in me, rather than thinking, oh, I'm fighting with my colleague, therefore I'm a hypocrite, or they're a hypocrite, we should all be.
Yeah. So Irene, you deal with, you're as an educator too, you've worked in these writing workshops with kids. Kids can be in conflict. So what comes to mind as an experience like this that you recall?
Well, actually, it wasn't the teaching that came to my mind. What came to my mind was my brother. I had a very brilliant, very verbal brother. So this is going to sort of slip around what you were saying, because he would bombard us with language, with facts, with with political things, and had not the capacity to really understand what our responses were. We later realized this is before the spectrum was even thought of. So he had challenges that we didn't even realize. But that being said, it was very difficult to hold a conversation with him on anything, because he was always right, and he was, and so like. But what allowed us to have a relationship eventually was that, and this is for you, Reggie, he was a guitarist, and we were able to sing together, and we were able to actually harmonize in a very beautiful way. So we were sharing these words, but more than that, we were sharing, and that's what I keep going back to in terms of language, in terms of words. It is the meaning, the intention behind, and that's something that music and songs do so well. So we were able to reach a place of peace by singing together, because of course you also have to listen to one another when you're singing if you're going to make a good sound.
Right.
So that's what popped into my head.
Wow.
Right. And Reggie, I don't want to force you to that Cobleskill Green, but it is an awfully good example of this, unless one other come to mind.
Well, the first one that came to mind is one that was years and years ago when, after being so frustrated about landing in situations where I was kind of being called on to make some impact in racial discussions or on community campuses, college campuses, where the Black Student Union would hire, actually the White Student Union would hire my partner and I to come in and do a concert, thinking that it would bridge the gap that they had on campus with, Black students. And we were always kind of in the middle, and I had no skills. So I went to get some skills, taking some trainings from National Coalition Building Institute and some others. And I found myself being hired by a college campus to come and do a semester of diversity training. I should have known better to know that I was way over my head, but it was a learning experience. And on one particular weekend that I was leading trainings, we were just having conversations between people. And one of the people who hired me, the dean of students there, at a session that we had when students began to unburden themselves about things that were going on and actually telling the truthful stories of their oppression, he panicked. And he started lobbing in these grenades of, well, yeah, but we're really doing well, and just completely making it impossible for me to lead this session where people were sort of getting their stuff out. And I called a timeout, and I just told everybody to go outside and just think about, I had no idea where to go, tell you the truth. And I just said, go outside. We're in a beautiful place. Find somewhere where you can think about what happened this morning, and we'll come back later and do something. And and I was the first one out of the building, and I went down and I went on a walk, and it landed me on top of this hill where there was a bench, and I saw the bench and I started for the bench. So I was just going to go up there and try to come up with something to do in the afternoon. What I didn't know was this guy had gone out and he took a different path, but he came up the hill from the opposite direction. Saw the bench. We landed on the bench together. And we looked at each other, and I was so angry, and so was he. And to this day, neither of us, because we've talked about this since, neither of us can remember who spoke first. But we both just kind of launched into a conversation about why we felt so, at odds in that morning, and what our concerns were. Completely different lives, completely different agendas. But in that moment, it was broken, and he agreed not to disarm, to do the same thing in the afternoon. And I decided that it was right to let people speak their truth, because we never get to the real issues until we really hear what's on the table. And out of that also came a song. But yeah, it was a learning experience for me, because I also learned in that moment that the reason that I had decided to become a conflict, person who worked on conflict, were for the wrong reasons. I thought I could heal all of this just by being my gregarious, wonderful self, using the meager skills that I had. And so there was a lot in me that had to change as well.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll try to fit in a little bit on this, the anatomy of conflict theory, putting it into practice. Pádraig, you had talked about that a minute ago, and I'd love to have a song and or a poem or even a stanza from each of you on those points. That you know what, Reggie, though, you reminded me just now of a center I discovered in near Boulder, Colorado. Actually, Fort Collins. It's the John Wesley Powell Center for Synthesis and Analysis. Incredibly clunky name, but the Geological Survey, a federal government, created this center for scientists to go and hash out their disputes. And you think of science. Science is not a gentle practice. It's everyone has their razors sharpened, and this is disputes over stuff that matters, earthquake prediction and the like. And they go there, and one of the things they do, well, they have several rules of the house. One rule of the house is when you're sitting around presenting your talks, like your 5-minute, this is what I think. You have to spend the last minute articulating your critic's point of view in your own words, which I thought is really cool.
Yeah.
And they go on hikes. This is in the pre-COVID world. And when you're hiking in the Rocky Mountains, you don't have enough breath to argue. So that's what reminded me of your hill walk.
Well, I was so curious about the hill walk too, Reggie, in the sense of what was that impulse in you? Maybe it was just, I don't know what to do, so let's get a break. But what was that impulse in you that knew that nature too would have something to say? Obviously, there's the immediate escape of, well, look, it's beautiful, so take a breath. But there's something deeper than that too. I'm curious what that was in you.
Well, we were at a retreat center that a friend of mine started, and I think in that moment, I realized that the very purpose of that place was to get people out of their own minds, out of their own miasma, just to collect oneself. And since we were there, I think it's a Franciscan place that contemplative in its nature. I think in that moment I was grasping at straws. But for myself, because that was a very atypical thing for me to do. I'm not a hiker and I don't tend to go on walks. But in that moment, I think the desperation of knowing that, first of all, I was over my head, and secondly, I was angry, and in that moment, I think the desperation of those two things made me realize that I had this resource. And fortunately, I decided to use it.
So interesting.
Joy Harjo is the current American Poet Laureate, first Native person to hold that role since the inauguration of that role of the Poet Laureate to the Library of Congress in the United States. And she has a poem called Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings. It's an amazing poem. And she takes the spine of conflict resolution, establish some ground rules, listen to each other, those very basic things that anybody going through a half-hour course even on conflict resolution would be told, those basic things. And she writes a poem in response to a very basic spine of mediation. And the first one is called Establish Ground Rules. And what she does is to look into the richness of the word ground rather than rules. And what you described, Reggie, made me think about that, which is to say that every conflict happens on ground, unless it's in an airplane, I suppose. But, therefore, 99.9% of our conflicts happen on ground. And what does the ground have to say? And there's something really powerful in your intuition, even though you were grasping at straws, but nonetheless, your intuition to know that the environment has something to say about this.
Wow, that's powerful.
I want to bring up one other thing here and actually play a very short video clip that came up to mind, because I only really started to think about conflict mediation. Well, two things happened. In the early aughts, I met Ted Keel, who was a labor mediator, famous labor mediator in New York. He became a philanthropist. He made a lot of money late in life. And he talked about the anatomy of dispute. As a mediator, as a lawyer, there are disputes of interest, he had a way of, he took me away from this sort of general sense that people are fighting to the ability to piece it apart. And then in 2010, I was at the climate negotiations, which I've attended, unfortunately, for, since the early 90s, or written about. And I met a guy there who was a conflict mediator. Let me just play this. I couldn't believe it. This is like this, every climate talk. This was in Cancun. They're all, they were in Glasgow. They have these little booths. All the green groups are there, and some of the anti-green groups are there. And here is this lonely guy. Let's see if this works. You'll see.
Here at the yet another round of the climate talks with Alan Gross from Mediators Without Borders, and I saw his booth here, and it reminded me of Ted Keel, who I wrote about recently on God Earth, who was a master at getting into a room with people with pretty hardcore disputes and finding a way forward. So I was just asking Alan some things, and I'm going to ask him to sort of play the role of the mediator. Suppose the basic parties, blocks here, knocked on your door at Mediators Without Borders, and they said, here I am, we're the super poor countries, here we are, we're the emerging less poor countries, China. I'm the United States, and over there is Europe and the rest of everybody, and we've got a big problem. And here you've probably gotten a sense of what these problems are about. They're about money, vulnerability, responsibility. What would you do? What's your first step?
First of all, from your lips to God's ears, we wish we had an opportunity to mediate between these people, because right now they're just making each other and posturing to a large extent, although there's some good intentions here. So what some mediators would do, and they all have different techniques, what I would do is separate them, talk to them individually, and try to dig down to what their real interests are, if they're willing to be transparent, that's a big mediation word, and honest with us, and then, only then, talk to them about how they could try to understand what the other parties were trying to get across before it's much easier to speak than it is to listen. So if they can understand each other, then they at least have an opportunity to seek common ground and to buy into a mutually acceptable solution instead of one that's imposed on them by some international court.
So I won't go on, but it was pretty cool.
Yeah,
and of course he said he wasn't being listened to. And since those talks, I can tell you there hasn't been a lot of that kind of spirit there. It's still mostly posturing and big stances, and it makes me discouraged. I think at the local level, in a community, seeking resilience, seeking ways to limit losses from wildfire or the like, there's plenty of room for this process. But so Pádraig, I think this is part of your goal going forward this year, is to dig in on climate and language. So just give a brief sense of that, and then we'll get into a little bit of some readings and maybe song before we close out.
Yeah, I'm interested in the poetry that knows stuff about land, and the poetry that knows stuff about the relationship with land. That is not new. People have been writing poems about land for millennia, and people have been writing poems about conflict for millennia. There's nothing new about that. Maybe there's something new about wider audiences paying attention. But there are communities of people that have been issuing laments for a very long time. And lament is a very old form of poetry that has so much information within the context of it. I trained in theology, as you mentioned, and the Hebrew book of Lamentations is an extraordinary demonstration about what is it that you say in the wake of the destruction of a city, and how many places around the world do we know of that have gone through destruction. We think of Darfur. That's just one of the cities that comes to mind as you think of the destruction. I live in Belfast, another city that you associate with destruction and with violence. And how is it that we can pay attention to the poetry of lamentation, and not in order to convince everybody to agree on everything going forward, but there can be, through art, a connection point that can transcend questions of measurable agreement. And strangely, you can find the energy for collaboration sometimes when there is a certain kind of cathartic engagement with each other.
Interesting. So maybe here's the time to get into a little bit of some reflexive reading or the like. Irene, did you have a
Well,
piece of sorts?
it's not exactly about conflict, but I was just
Okay.
thinking about words, because you had talked about language as being a place that we were gonna that we were talking about
Yeah.
today. And I have a little a very short piece from a book of mine called Glad to Be Human. It's called Words on a Page. Waiting for a train, I heard one young woman tell another, "My brother says, why should I read? It's just words on a page." It struck me to the heart, these words in the air. And though I'm selling tuxedos to penguins, should someone ever ask you, why board a train? I want to say, it's just cars on a track. It only gets you places hard to get to on your own and a whole lot faster. But shock occasions reflection, and reflection gratitude. Words on a page, important like boxcars for what they convey, which is us. Reading, we ride with the engineer. Worlds of our joint creation spring up around the locomotive. Nonfiction writers can take us anywhere. This author explained the Arctic, for example. Yes, this one did. Andy did. For example, so I can share somewhat in that experience. What expert scouts good writers are. Fiction writers take us inside each other, inside ourselves. They train our inner ear to our inner life, that slippery, ongoing stream of psychological states which filter, flow, and congeal into physical experience. And poets? Well, they don't use tracks at all. They just beam us from place to place. Isn't it wonderful, this magical travel through each other's minds and experience, even if sometimes the page is glowing glass, not paper.
Beautiful.
That is. What's the name of your book?
Oh, it's called Glad to Be Human. Whoops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do love that title. And the essay, Glad to Be Human, is beautiful. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think he's coming back. Hey.
Hi, not sure what happened there.
Yeah, well, here we are. Pádraig, is there something you might read that could shed some light and heat on this?
Yeah. I've got a short sonnet. Well, they're all short, aren't they? Sonnets called The Tree of Knowledge. And this plays with, I suppose, the agricultural imagination that you find in those early poems in Genesis and the Hebrew Bible. The Tree of Knowledge. Having eaten only one fruit from it, we cut the Tree of Knowledge down. We broke its boughs, ripped it from the land it fed and fed from. Some man made branches with machines. Some woman cut new leaves from steel. The tree sent up its sighs, lamenting that the land it held together could no longer now be held together. From the tree's remains, we made paper, but words kept on appearing on the pages with warnings that we didn't want to read. We burned it, dumped it, waited. We want something else to save us.
Oh my.
I'm curious in art, as well as in spirituality, as well as in conflict, about the response to this most terrible question, which is, what do you want? And I think often it is a much more difficult question to answer than we think. And it is, I think that's one of the questions that extraordinary movie, Don't Look Up, is playing with. You know, what do you want? Do you want to survive or do you want to win? And the gap between that is one of the existential gaps that's explored in that satirical but nonetheless arresting film. What do you want? Because if you say we want to survive, well then all kinds of collaborations are going to be necessary, all kinds of compromises, all kinds of dialogues, all kinds of associations. But if you want to win, if you want to be pure, well then you'll die pure, because there's no such possibility of survival without the possibility of engaging with the parts of yourself, never mind others. And so for me, this poem explores the question about that most difficult thing. What do you want?
Yeah, at the end, for those who've seen the film, I don't think it's necessary to worry about spoilers. There's an incredibly poignant ending. It's sort of satirical and sharp and nasty, and then it ends with it's sort of a family setting, sitting at a table. Of course, it's too late, and that poignancy. It captivated a lot of people at the end too. It's not just the humor and the nya kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting. And Reggie, what's on your musical mind and heart?
How much of this song do you want?
Oh, come on. We have time.
Okay.
All of it.
Well, this is the song that came from that hilltop experience. And I will say that I don't remember how long it took me to write the song. It was years, not months. And that's all I'll say. We sit alone together, each from our different worlds, suspicious of each other, position flags unfurled. So much lies broken between us, lines of connection down, standing in ruins of pain and mistrust, searching for common ground. So we stumble through our points of view, logic falls apart. In that moment of confusion, we see a place to start. Through the windows of the heart. We sit in silence and wonder, where do we go from here? Frustration dragging us under, no resolutions clear. We feel the anger, this desperation to turn this world around. Each of our faces a mirror, searching for common ground. So we lower our defenses, watch them fall apart. In that moment of confusion, we see a place to start. Through the windows of the heart. So we lower our defenses, watch them fall apart. In that moment of communion, we see a place to start. Through the windows of the heart.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
I do miss the days of sitting in a living room playing together.
It's one of the great losses of this pandemic.
Yeah.
Oh my God. There have been some brief moments. I've been up in Beacon at David Burns's store, which is kind of a musical hub. And but then Omicron came in, and we're on this long journey. Let's briefly, we have about 4 minutes left, maybe talk about one thing that comes up over and over again is time. I think about Dan Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is only about the thinking part, not the feeling part. And the slow thinking is the thinking about your own thinking, is that stopping, where reflecting on your own predilections. And feelings make it even harder when you're locked into disputes. And, I'm running this series I've just launched on what I call watchwords, words that get misinterpreted or that are labels more than meaningful. Denier is one in the climate arena. So just how important is time? And it's precious and short, and we abuse it all the time. Pádraig, is that one of the grand challenges, is getting the time?
Well, I mean, for me, time is the great character in every poem. I'm always curious about how time functions in poetry. And time is, in a good poem, time is always doing many things at the same time. It's going forward, it's going backwards. The past is not the past. The past is the present. The past is an indicator of the future or a warning. And so when I think of the question of conflict and climate, and time, I find myself paying attention to the need for paying attention to time. If I could have one global wish, it would be that the British royal family would initiate a truth commission into the history of empire. That is what I would, and it would be independent from them. I would not wish any of them to be a figurehead within it. I wish them to learn from it rather than be decorated for it. There's nothing inspiring about people being held accountable. They have been doing it for centuries, or the various British royal families, and not just the British, all the European colonial forces. And that, to my mind, is an indication of the necessity of a relationship with time, and the indication that the past is not the past for everybody. And therefore, I think when it comes to questions to do with climate emergency, there is also a need for paying attention to what the past has known. There's nothing new about paying attention to what it means to be a population on a planet. So,
yes, and exploring those different dimensions of time around words. Like right now, I did a conversation a week ago on the word collapse, which when a glaciologist studying Antarctica uses the word, he or she is talking in scale of centuries. But when it heads into a new newspaper headline or a tweet, it's interpreted as, oh my God, take cover, the oceans are about to rise like a tsunami. And just getting comfortable with talking about words, I think, backing off from the word is part of this path of going forward. If you can go over a couple minutes, we're right at the end. I don't know if anyone has to cut out, but if you don't, maybe Irene, your last going away thought on what would be a good step toward grappling with this?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, there is no time like the present. For me, the solution is in increased presence wherever we are, with whomever we are talking, to be fully here in physical reality and relating to what is immediately around us, so that can travel outward. Our conversation is already traveling outward, and yet it's because it happened in this present moment, which is now gone. That's the astonishment of being a physical being. So I believe the more deeply we pay attention to the present moment, that's where those solutions are. That's why that happened, Reggie, because you felt it there on that bench with this man. It's so I just say, pay loving attention to where you are and what you are doing, and the inner prompts that come through you are the healing that's necessary for us all.
It's beautifully articulated. And Reggie, a last thought on this idea?
I'm thinking so much these days about the fact that in the pandemic, I was exposed to having more time. And out of that came both creativity and a sense of urgency. I'm reminded that people in power are able to adjust time to their benefit, and that people who are not in power are constantly against the crush of not having time to consider themselves and their situation. And I'm just seeing that played out so much more in our public and global life. So I'm at this moment, I'm looking at myself, my art, my work, and trying to figure how to focus on that and to help people focus on it in being more present to the time in their lives. I think it's happening in one sense, but I don't, we know that people have chosen time over work.
Yeah.
And it's disturbing the world greatly.
Yeah, right. It's true. It's beautiful.
Metamorphosis. This is
Yeah.
how it happened.
Yeah. Well, it's just been great. Perhaps we can visit again sometime.
It'd be lovely.
Sometime soon. This was I'm really happy to introduce you to each other.
This is marvelous.
And
Real pleasure.
this is just showing a line from Pádraig's website, which you mentioned this phrase. What's the key to this phrase being so central, Pádraig? I think it's pretty obvious, but
I think it's the phrase that has shaped my life. Ska chéile waras na daoine is how you say it in Irish. And one translation of that into English is, it is in the shelter of each other that the people live. But the word ska there, shelter, can also translate as shadow. And the word waras there for live might also mean survive. And so the word chéile, meaning together, that's also related to a certain engagement about gatherings. It isn't just happenstance who's together. Céile is the name for a lovely gathering in terms of music and poetry. And so in a certain sense, this phrase, this old proverb, old saying, probably from the west of Ireland, speaks to me about what does it mean to pay attention to the here and now. It isn't an abstract idea about a heaven or a future. It's an utterly concrete idea about the here and the now, and that interests me enormously because it requires commitment. Therefore, in order to think about how can I make our gatherings together be ones of shelter.
And that extends to every level of living, from the village to the household to the earth. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Pádraig Ó Tuama, Irene O'Garden,
This was fun.
Reggie Harris.
Thank you.
Let's do this again through the course
Yeah,
of
it'd
the
be
Fair
month.
enough.
I'd love to.
I'd be
We can
delighted.
expand the circle too. This is the Sustain What webcast from Columbia Climate School, Andy Revkin, and you can share this as soon as we're done on the platform you're watching, and get in touch with me for future shows or any feedback using the information in that distracting scrolling bar at the bottom. And thank you again to my guests for being here, and good luck with you each day going forward doing the work, and the joy that you spread is priceless.
Be very well.
Take care.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the welcome. Lovely to meet everyone.